My name is Amelia Grant, and I was 35 years old when my father stood at the head of his dining room table on a Sunday evening, lifted a glass of sweet tea like he was about to bless the whole family with good news, and announced that my younger brother would be moving into my grandmother's house because, in his words, a man needs a house more than a single woman needs memories. I can still hear the way the room laughed too softly, the way my stepmother Elaine smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had already decided the argument was over before it began, and the way my brother Caleb sat there pretending to look embarrassed while his hand rested on the folder that held contractor estimates for a house he did not own. I had spent the afternoon bringing a peach cobbler and a box of winter utility receipts from Grandma Rose's property because I thought we were finally going to talk honestly about the repairs, the unpaid taxes I had covered over the years, and the probate paperwork everyone kept avoiding. Instead, my father used Sunday dinner to erase me from the story of the house I had quietly protected for almost a decade. Then he looked straight at me and said, "Amelia, you have no husband and no children. Caleb needs that house to build a real family." Before I tell you how a county title record, an old brass key, and my grandmother's letter turned that dinner into the most expensive mistake my father and brother ever made, tell me this. What time is it where you are right now, and where are you watching from? I want to know how far this story travels before I tell you what happens when a family calls it legacy, when a son wants an inheritance, calls it paperwork when a daughter defends it, and then learns that the paper was signed by the one person in the family who still knew exactly who showed up and who only showed off. Because that dinner was not the beginning. It was only the first time my father said out loud what he had been trying to do quietly for years. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a family where the men inherited importance before they ever inherited anything else. My father, Richard Grant, believed in hierarchy with the same devotion some men reserve for religion. Sons carried names, daughters married out. Men built houses, women made them warm and stayed grateful for the invitation. That was the spirit of his worldview, even when he dressed it up in softer language. My mother died when I was 17, and about 3 years later, he married Elaine, a woman with polished hair, careful opinions, and a special talent for turning cruelty into concern. Elaine never openly insulted me in the early years. She did something more efficient. She praised me for being practical, independent, and self-sufficient every time she wanted to justify giving more to Caleb. If I got less, it was because I didn't need much. If Caleb got rescued, it was because he was still finding his footing. If I objected, I was told I should be proud not to need the same support. Caleb was younger than me by 4 years and had grown up believing consequences were rude interruptions to his potential. He was handsome in the easy way that made people underestimate how much of his life had been quietly carried by other people. He moved through jobs the way some men move through hobbies: mortgage office trainee, short-term sales rep, landscaping startup. 2 years doing entrepreneurial consulting, which mostly meant borrowing money and talking loudly. But in my father's eyes, Caleb was always the future of the Grant family because he was a son, because he smiled like he believed in his own importance, and because one day he would have children who carried the name. I, on the other hand, became a real estate paralegal. I learned title records, deed language, survivorship rights, tax delinquencies, quit-claim traps, estate transfers, and the 1,000 tiny details that make the difference between a house belonging to the right person and a family lying about it long enough to create damage. I liked the work because documents do not flatter themselves. A deed either says your name or it does not. A tax bill was either paid or it was not. A title search either matched the story or exposed it. I trusted that clarity more than I trusted family memory. The person who shaped that part of me most was my grandmother, Rose Grant. Grandma Rose lived in a modest white brick house with green shutters, a deep back porch, and a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon, lemon oil, and old wood every season of the year. After my mother died, I spent most weekends there. I cleaned gutters, sorted mail, drove her to appointments, changed air filters, sat with her during flu seasons, and learned the difference between the family she hosted and the family she relied on. Caleb rarely came unless there was a holiday meal or the possibility of borrowing the truck. My father came when there was a dramatic repair he wanted to discuss in front of neighbors. Elaine came when she wanted to bring flowers and leave before the dishes. But Grandma knew who fixed the leaking faucet, who took the tax notices seriously, who sat beside her when the furnace made strange sounds at midnight, and who helped her compare insurance letters she could no longer read without getting tired. Once, when I was 27 and patching the back screen door after a storm, she handed me an old brass key from the house and said, "This house remembers who showed up." I laughed and told her she was being dramatic. She shrugged and said, "Old women don't get dramatic. We get observant." I kept that key on my work key ring after that, more as a sentimental object than anything else, though later it would become the one thing I reached for when I needed to remind myself I was not imagining the whole family history. By the time I was 29, Grandma's house had become a running family conversation whenever money was short. My father spoke about it as the Grant home. Caleb called it the old place, usually when talking about ideas for renovation he never funded. Elaine talked about how beautiful it would be for the next generation. None of them talked about the overdue property taxes that arrived one spring after Grandma missed a notice during a bad winter. I was the one who found the delinquency letter in a stack of catalogs and church donation envelopes. I was the one who called the county office. I was the one who learned the grace period and the amount due. My father promised the family would handle it together. Caleb said he'd pitch in when a client check cleared. Elaine said she had to move money around. I paid it from my savings because Grandma's voice shook when she asked if they would take the house. A month later, at a family cookout, my father told relatives Caleb had helped save the house. I stood by the cooler holding a plate of sliced watermelon and realized something I should have understood much sooner. In my family, my labor became family effort the moment a man needed the credit. Still, I kept helping. That is the part people always ask about later. Why did you keep helping? Because Grandma lived there. Because she was proud of never having asked her children for too much. Because the house still smelled like safety to me. Because grief makes some women practical and some women loyal long after loyalty has stopped being rewarded. Because every time I thought about stepping back, I pictured Grandma sitting alone at the kitchen table, opening some official envelope she did not understand, and I could not do it. Over the years, I paid insurance gaps, emergency plumbing bills, winterization costs, roof patch repairs, lawn service when she hurt her knee, and one especially humiliating locksmith invoice after Caleb borrowed the spare key, lost it for 6 weeks, and then laughed when I asked if he planned to replace the locks. I kept receipts because I am a real estate paralegal, and because somewhere deep down, I already knew the family story would need to be corrected one day. Grandma's health declined slowly, but her mind stayed clear in the important ways much longer than my father liked. She saw through people even when her hands trembled. About 2 years before she died, she called me over one Thursday evening and asked me to sit at the kitchen table. There was tea, a notepad, and that old, careful look on her face she wore when she wanted a conversation to survive her. "Your father thinks he understands legacy," she said. "He understands names. He doesn't always understand love." I told her not to talk like that. She ignored me. "If they ever tell you this house belongs to the loudest man, show them the paper I signed when I was still clear enough to know who loved me quietly." Then she reached into the drawer beside the stove and handed me an envelope I did not open until much later. At the time, I thought it was just another old woman precaution, maybe a note, maybe a memory, maybe instructions about the hydrangeas. I didn't know that she had already acted on the thought, not just written it down. When she died, the funeral itself told me everything I needed to know about the coming battle. My father spoke about family roots. Caleb cried loudly. Elaine comforted everyone in a way that seemed designed for witnesses. At the reception, someone mentioned how lucky Caleb was that one day he could keep Grandma's house in the family. I corrected them automatically and said the estate had not been settled. My father touched my elbow and said, too softly to make a scene, "Don't turn your grandmother's memory into paperwork just because you work around lawyers." I should have pushed harder then. Instead, I waited because I was grieving, because I expected at least a basic respect for process, and because part of me still believed the family would not do anything openly shameless while the flowers were fresh. I underestimated how shameless people become when they have already rehearsed the story in their heads. For months after the funeral, the house remained in limbo. I kept the utility accounts active because if I didn't, the pipes would freeze in winter. I paid the insurance renewal because an uncovered vacant property is an invitation to disaster. I covered the lawn care and the small roof repair after a branch tore shingles during a storm. I also asked my father, twice by email and once in person, when we were going to discuss the house formally. Each time he pushed the conversation. Caleb said he was exploring options. Elaine said everyone needed time. Then came the first sign that they weren't just delaying, they were circling. A lender emailed me directly because my name appeared as owner of record contact on a title-linked notice. The subject line mentioned a financing inquiry tied to Grandma's property address. I opened it and discovered Caleb had attempted to move forward with renovation financing using the house as collateral. The lender's office had run a basic title pull and hit a problem. His name was not on the deed. Mine was. I stared at the screen long enough for the words to blur. At first, I thought it had to be an error, some old drafting issue, maybe an unrecorded transfer or a probate note entered incorrectly. Then I drove to the county recorder's office on my lunch break and pulled the chain of title myself. There it was, recorded cleanly and properly 2 years before Grandma died. Rose Grant had conveyed the property by survivorship deed to herself and Amelia Grant as joint tenants with right of survivorship. After her death, title had vested in me by operation of law. The house was not eventually mine through a contested inheritance. It was already mine. Legally. Quietly. Deliberately. My hands actually shook when I paid for the certified copies. I took them straight to Marisol Vega, the real estate attorney I had worked under for 4 years, and one of the only people in my professional life who could read my face before I spoke. She looked at the deed, then at me, then back at the deed. "Did your family know?" she asked. "Grandma knew," I said. "That's not what I asked." She was right. I did not know whether my father had discovered it already, whether Caleb had only just learned through the lender issue, or whether they were both counting on my ignorance. Then I remembered the envelope Grandma had given me. I went home, pulled it from my desk, and opened it. Inside was a letter in her handwriting and a copy of the deed she had recorded. The line that split me open was near the end. "If they ever tell you this house belongs to the loudest man, show them the paper I signed when I was still clear enough to know who loved me quietly." I sat on my apartment floor and cried with the deed in one hand and the brass key in the other. Not because the house suddenly meant money to me, but because for the first time in years, I had proof that someone in my family had seen the whole pattern and chosen to protect me before she died. That should have been enough to settle things cleanly. It was not. Because 3 weeks later, my father invited everyone to Sunday dinner and used it to announce Caleb's move as if he was handing down wisdom from a mountain. He said the house needed a real family in it. Elaine said it would be healing to hear children in those rooms one day. Caleb kept talking about restoring the kitchen and opening up the wall between the dining room and den, plans he had apparently already paid a contractor to estimate. Then my father looked at me and said a man needs a house more than a single woman needs memories. I asked, as calmly as I could, whether either of them would like to explain why Caleb was seeking financing on a property he did not own. Silence hit the room like somebody had dropped a serving platter. Caleb's wife looked confused. Elaine's face lost color first, then composure. My father said, "Don't start performing legal tricks." I said, "A recorded deed is not a trick." He snapped that Grandma would have wanted peace. I said, "Then why did she record survivorship interest in my name?" Caleb stood up then and said, "This is unbelievable. You really would take the family house from your brother?" I looked at him and said, "You mean the brother who changed locks on a house he doesn't own and tried to use it for a loan?" That was the first moment I saw panic under his entitlement. Not guilt, panic. Because he had already taken steps. After I left that dinner, Marisol helped me move fast. We filed a formal title notice with the lender contact. We sent cease communications regarding any unauthorized listing or financing attempt. I arranged a legal lock change the next morning because Caleb had, in fact, already moved some furniture into the house and changed one side door lock without authority. Mr. Harlan, Grandma's longtime next-door neighbor, met me there on the porch and said, "I figured this day was coming. Your brother's been acting like it's his place for weeks." He had seen the moving truck, the contractor, and Elaine directing where boxes should go. He had also seen Caleb bragging to another neighbor that he was finally getting the family house settled in his name. That statement became important later. I walked through Grandma's house that morning with the locksmith and felt two emotions at once. Relief, because the law was finally clear. Heartbreak, because I had to protect that clarity from people who shared my blood. Caleb had moved in a cheap sectional, 2 bar stools, and a stack of boxes labeled kitchen stuff. He hadn't even brought anything that made the place feel lived in. It looked like he had staged ownership the way children stage adulthood. I had the locks changed, the utilities confirmed, and a notice posted on the refrigerator that occupancy required my written consent. Then the phone calls began. Elaine first. "Amelia, you are making your brother homeless over paperwork." I told her he had a lease in his apartment for another 2 months and a wife with parents 10 miles away. She said I was being technical. I said, property law often is. Then my father called at 10:37 p.m., his voice low and furious. "What did you tell the county clerk?" That was his first question. Not, "Why are you doing this?" Not, "Can we talk?" "What did you tell the county clerk?" There it was. Panic. I answered, "Nothing they didn't already have in the record." Silence. Then he said exactly what I needed him to say. "Caleb needed that deed fixed before the lender discovered the house was still in your name." Still in my name. Not mistakenly, not surprisingly. Still. Which meant he had known. Maybe not from the beginning, but long enough to try to outmaneuver it. I wrote the sentence down while he was still talking. He said I needed to stop humiliating the family. Elaine grabbed the phone at one point and said I should risk a little pride because Caleb's future children deserved the family house more than I deserved empty rooms. I laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because sometimes cruelty becomes so transparent it stops being able to disguise itself as morality. I gave them 72 hours. Remove unauthorized belongings, reimburse the taxes and repairs I had covered if they wanted to discuss anything from a place of honesty. Correct the family narrative. Sign a formal temporary occupancy agreement if Caleb wanted to stay short-term. And stop telling anyone the property was his. My father called me bitter. Caleb texted that I was choosing paper over blood. I responded with a photo of the certified deed and said, blood didn't pay the taxes. The smear campaign came fast. Elaine posted a vague message about women who choose legal control over family legacy. My father told relatives I was trying to steal the family home because I was bitter that Caleb had a wife and future children. One cousin texted to say I should be careful not to look greedy. Greedy. The woman who had paid taxes, repairs, insurance, and utilities on a house my brother had tried to finance under himself. The old wound opened then, the one daughters in families like mine carry quietly. Maybe if I protect myself, they'll say I'm cruel. Maybe if I enforce the document, they'll say I'm proving women shouldn't be trusted with property. Maybe if I stop yielding, the whole family will remember me as the sister who made her brother nearly homeless instead of the one who carried the house for years. I sat with that for one evening. Then I took out Grandma's letter and read it again. The person who protects a home is not always the person shouting the family name. I held the brass key in my palm until the edge pressed a mark into my skin, and something inside me settled. It did not matter what story my father preferred. It mattered what Grandma had recorded while she was clear. The private truth room happened at my apartment table the next night. My father came because he thought anger still gave him authority in rooms where he no longer controlled the documents. Caleb came because he still believed he could talk me into becoming the dutiful sister one more time. Elaine came because she had trained herself to sound like reason when other people were listening. Marisol joined by speakerphone first, then in person later when I told her the conversation was going exactly where she expected. On the table were Grandma's brass key, the certified deed record, years of tax receipts, insurance payments, locksmith invoice, utility records, repair bills, the lender email, Caleb's attempted listing material, and a recording from Sunday dinner I had started on my phone halfway through my father's announcement once I realized what he was doing. Caleb looked at the papers and said, "This is crazy." I answered, "No, this is title history." My father tried the old line, "You only helped with paperwork." I slid the tax receipts forward. I was useful when taxes were due and selfish when ownership was read. Elaine said, "No one is saying you didn't help." I put the utility bills on top of the repair invoices. That's interesting, because at dinner I was told a single woman only needed memories. Caleb leaned back and crossed his arms. Grandma would have wanted the house used by family. I am family, I said, and she handled that preference with a deed. That was when Marisol, who had been listening quietly, said, "For clarity, Richard, Caleb, the property is not passing through your preferred narrative. It is titled to Amelia by survivorship. Any attempt to represent otherwise to a lender, broker, or county office creates exposure." My father snapped that lawyers had ruined women like me. Marisol replied, calm as stone, "No, deeds complicate men like you." I could have hugged her through the table. Then Caleb made the mistake that ended all ambiguity. He said, "It's not like you were going to live there anyway." The room went silent, not because it was surprising, because it was true enough to expose the whole machine. They did not want the house because Caleb had a deep emotional claim. They wanted it because they believed a woman without husband or children could be pressured into surrendering it, especially if the surrender could be framed as noble. I repeated my terms. Temporary lease at market-adjusted family rate if Caleb truly needed short-term housing, and agreed in writing to every condition. Full reimbursement discussion for my past expenditures if they wanted any moral conversation about fairness. Immediate correction of all lender and contractor communications. Public correction to family. Remove the lie that the house was being taken from Caleb. He had never owned it. My father stood up and said, "You are humiliating your brother." I looked at the brass key. No, the title record did that. The public truth room happened 3 days later at a county recorder-related title review meeting Marisol arranged, partly because Caleb's lender needed formal clarity, partly because an attempted unauthorized listing had surfaced, and partly because once Elaine started spreading lies at church, I wanted the truth anchored somewhere official and witnessed. Present were me, my father, Caleb, Elaine, Marisol, a county clerk, the lender's title representative, and Mr. Harlan, who came because I asked whether he would be willing to confirm who had actually maintained the property over the years. That room did something family rooms never do. It forced everyone to speak in relation to paper rather than preference. The county clerk reviewed the recorded survivorship deed. The lender representative confirmed Caleb's renovation financing had been paused because he was not owner of record. The attempted listing had been withdrawn once proof of title was provided. Caleb tried to say he had only been preparing to take responsibility. Marisol asked, "Responsibility for whose property?" He had no answer that didn't make him look either dishonest or ridiculous. My father said Grandma had always intended the house to remain with the Grant family line. I placed Grandma's letter on the table beside the certified deed and read the line aloud. "If they ever tell you this house belongs to the loudest man, show them the paper I signed when I was still clear enough to know who loved me quietly." Then I placed years of tax receipts and repair bills beside it. "This is the family line I'm interested in," I said. "The one that follows actual care, actual payment, actual presence, and the actual deed." Elaine said I was choosing paperwork over family legacy. I answered, "A deed does not become less real because a father prefers his son." That landed harder than anything else I said, because everybody in that room knew it was true. The county clerk, who had no stake in the emotion and therefore all the power of indifference, confirmed there was no current title defect. Ownership rested with me. Any transfer would require my voluntary execution of a new deed. Not my father's blessing, not Caleb's need, mine. That single sentence changed the whole oxygen in the room. My father could not patriarch his way past the record. Caleb's loan collapsed by the end of the week. The contractor deposit he had promised from financing never materialized. Elaine's plan to announce at church that Caleb was restoring the Grant family home was quietly canceled after I sent the pastor's office a short, respectful note clarifying that no such transfer had occurred and asking that they not repeat misinformation involving private property. Mr. Harlan gave a neighbor statement confirming he had seen me maintaining the house for years and had seen Caleb only in recent weeks after Grandma's death. It wasn't legally necessary, but it mattered emotionally because in families like mine, men often rely on the belief that if they say something long enough in public, it becomes truer than the quiet woman's receipts. After the meeting, my father stood in the parking lot with his jaw tight and his pride bleeding through every word. "So this is it?" he asked. "You'd rather own a house than have your family?" It was such a practiced line, such a polished manipulation, that I almost missed the deep fear underneath it. He had built a whole moral world around the assumption that daughters could be pressed backward with guilt. And there I was, standing in front of a county building holding the brass key, refusing. "I would rather honor Grandma than obey your hierarchy," I said. "Those are not the same thing." Caleb tried one last, softer route. "Amelia, I really do need a place." That was the only moment I let myself feel pity. Not enough to sign, enough to speak plainly. "Then you should have asked me as your sister, not moved in as if my ownership was an inconvenience you could outpace." In the end, I offered him exactly what I had offered before, a 6-month written temporary lease at a rate lower than market, but high enough to make the relationship honest, with strict maintenance obligations and no ownership claims. Elaine called it humiliating. Caleb called it insulting. My father said no son of his would rent from his own sister. I said then no son of yours will live in my house. He moved back into his apartment 2 weeks later. The consequences spread in the practical, unglamorous ways consequences often do. Caleb's marriage hit a rough patch because his wife learned far too late that the family house plan had been built on a lie. My father's church friends stopped praising his legacy speeches so confidently after it became known that the property story had not gone the way he told it. Elaine had to swallow the embarrassment of posts she deleted too late. But the part that mattered most to me was quieter. The house stayed mine, not in the greedy sense people tried to assign, but in the stewardship sense Grandma had intended. I spent the next spring repairing the porch, updating the wiring in the kitchen, and replanting the hydrangeas she loved. I moved in 6 months later, not because I had to prove ownership by occupancy, but because every room felt different once it was protected by truth instead of threatened by performance. The first night I slept there, I put Grandma's brass key in a shallow dish by the back door and cried in the kitchen because the house felt less like an asset and more like a sentence finally completed. Over time, I stopped hearing my father's line about real families when I walked through those rooms. I heard Grandma instead. This house remembers who showed up. Marisol helped me turn the experience into something useful, because women like me almost never realize how often family property coercion follows the same pattern. The practical daughter pays the tax bill. The unmarried daughter keeps up the maintenance. The widowed daughter handles the legal work. Then the son, the brother, or the nephew arrives with a wife, children, or simply a louder claim to legacy, and suddenly everyone expects the woman to sign for peace. So I started volunteering with a women's legal aid nonprofit and built the Brass Key Property Boundary Guide with Marisol. We taught daughters, widows, unmarried women, and caregivers how to check deed records, read survivorship language, document repair payments, avoid quitclaim pressure, understand title ownership, respond to lender surprises, and stop confusing family guilt with legal obligation. The first line of the guide was Grandma's. This house remembers who showed up. The second was mine. They called it family legacy when my brother wanted it, and paperwork when Grandma left it to me. At the first workshop, I placed the brass key on the table beside a sample deed and asked the women in the room how many of them had been told they were selfish for protecting property they were trusted to maintain. Almost every hand went up. One woman had paid 10 years of taxes on her late mother's home, only to be asked to sign it over to a brother with a family. Another had renovated her aunt's house and then called greedy when she refused a nephew's emotional demand. A widow in the second row started crying when I said, "Do not ask me to honor my loved one by ignoring the paper she signed to protect me." She told us afterward her in-laws had used that exact language to pressure her out of property her husband had legally titled to her. That is the thing about family coercion. It always tries to sound noble. It says peace, fairness, legacy, family line, future children. What would she have wanted? It almost never says what it means, which is, your labor counted, your love counted, your money counted, but only until a man wanted the result. The real revenge was not Caleb losing the loan, though I won't pretend that didn't feel deserved. It was not my father's humiliation in the parking lot, though he had earned every ounce of it. The real revenge was breaking the family script that said daughters protect assets until sons are ready to inherit them. It was living in the house without apology. It was teaching women how to pull a title record before they surrender under pressure. It was turning a brass key into a symbol of lawful boundaries instead of quiet burden. My relationship with my father never returned to what it had been, but if I'm honest, That relationship had been built on my willingness to accept less. Once that willingness died, what was left was simply the truth. He calls less often. Caleb keeps more distance. Elaine still performs injury when other relatives are present. None of that hurts the way it once would have, because I no longer mistake access for love. And Grandma's house, the one they said a single woman did not need, is full now. Not with the noisy proof of legitimacy my father wanted, but with a life that belongs to me. Friends on the back porch. Neighbors who knew Grandma and tell me stories over tomatoes in the summer. The kitchen table restored and covered with closing files some nights. Fresh bread others. A guest room for women passing through hard seasons. A home office where I answer emails from women who thought they were alone until they heard a story that sounded too much like their own. Sometimes at night, I lock the back door with Grandma's brass key and think about the sentence my father used as a weapon. A man needs a house. Maybe. But what I learned is that men like him often mean they need the symbol more than the shelter. They need proof that the family's center still tilts in their direction. And when it doesn't, they call the correction cruelty. A family that calls you selfish for protecting the inheritance legally left to you does not want legacy. It wants your silence, your labor, and your deed. If your family praised you while taxes were due and shamed you once ownership was clear, would you still call that tradition? And if the key your grandmother placed in your hand became the tool that taught other women not to sign away what love had already entrusted to them, would you tuck it back in a drawer to keep louder people comfortable? Or would you lay it on the table and let the deed speak for itself?